The leaders have already agreed on the declaration, but what does that then look like, especially when it comes to some of the issues around Argentina, for example? What does that mean? Is it a note, or what then does it mean for the process going forward? So we'll tell you in just a moment what that means. And Sherwin Bryce-Pease is standing by just to talk to us. My name is Bongi Wazwane, and Sherwin, lots of developments, lots of moving parts here. I feel like we've just been running from one story to another, as expected, of course, because there are some bilateral conversations. But perhaps let's take our viewers back, those who would have missed that moment when we got to understand that there's an overwhelming consensus, as told by President Cyril Ramaphosa.
It certainly, Bongi, was not expected in the opening session. And apparently the media was supposed to be kicked out as the President Ramaphosa was concluding his opening remarks in that opening session. And we were sort of privy to what was supposed to happen at closed doors. Let's adopt the declaration at the outset. And that speaks to, I think, the work that was done by the Sherpas. Understand, viewers, that it is not the heads of state that get into the granular detail. This is called high level. You deal with the broad themes of an outcome document, the broad themes of the policy and the persuasions you are seeking. It is the Sherpas, essentially the guides, right? The Sherpa means taking you up the Himalayas, the guide that will get you there. And they were the ones that worked through the nights painstakingly on this very broad agenda, a broad agenda that goes beyond the original mandate of the G20, that deals with macroeconomic stability, market stability, economic prosperity. They want stable markets as a representation of a world that is economically stable. The argument that countries of the developing South that have led the G20 since the Indonesians, followed by the Indians, the Brazilians, and now the climatic moment with South Africa's presidency is to broaden the mandate, a recognition that you cannot just focus on market stability and economic growth if people are poor, if people do not have food security, if there is no climate justice, and if there is no beneficiation for the raw materials that we know lie beneath the surface across the African continent, no less in South Africa. So a broad agenda here, a broad blueprint for how we need to deal with some of the ills that face African countries. Remember, this is the historic first African G20, the first historic South African presidency. You have the African Union in the room. So this is very much, I think the word Africa is mentioned throughout. It proliferates the outcome document. So very much an Africa agenda. The question now becomes, are African countries going to lead on this agenda, right? Are the Europeans going to come in and take over? Are the Americas or the Asians going to lead in terms of investment, in terms of the critical minerals that you know are absolutely central to an AI robotics future? And so the question now becomes, it's Africa's portfolio, if you will, in terms of what needs to happen. Will Africa lead on that portfolio? And
will Africa lead, right? Because the conversation about Africa, Sherwin, also speaks to the issue of debt, right? Because this is important for African countries, and it's a matter in which if they need to find a solution here, they also have to lead.
Absolutely. There's no question that this is Africa's moment. Just the obstacles that the South African presidency had to overcome, the consensus that they had to engender, the heavy diplomatic lifting that needed to happen in the face of opposition from the superpower of the world. And I think, beyond the substance and the details of what is in this 130-plus paragraph outcome document, a wonderful tribute to the work that our diplomats in South Africa did, the fortitude they displayed in terms of getting consensus around a very complex agenda. And with a complex agenda comes a complex level of implementation. It is going to take a continued solidarity, a continued sustainable approach to how we implement this agenda. Remember, we are now at the beginning of a process. You think now that we've adopted an agenda, we can all go home and sleep peacefully. Absolutely not. The work begins now. It's almost like you've just been elected and now you have to prove yourself.
And Sherwin, you and I have had this conversation, right? And it just happened. So we're seeing Argentina, and with some of our viewers asking that, how does this one play out then? Because if you're hearing that there's an overwhelming consensus, and then it seems that Argentina isn't happy with the issues around the Middle East.
And apparently issues around gender equity as well. Look, they've objected, we understand, to certain elements of the declaration. but apparently it was still adopted via consensus. Otherwise, they would have objected before the adoption happened. So I think consensus was unanimous. And then they mentioned certain elements that they do not agree with, and the presidency noted their objections. But essentially, we are hearing that because the G20 is an informal gathering of member states, there are no formal rules or prescripts that determine how they must function. And so critically, Zane Dangle, the lead Sherpa and the Director General in the Department of International Relations, said that the declaration speaks specifically about the consensus from the leaders who gathered in Johannesburg. That's what consensus means in this context. So the US has said it will not affirm, it will not endorse the decisions that are taken by the summit. But according to the leadership of the G20 here, they're saying because of the informal nature of the G20, there are no formal rules that are sort of sacrosanct that you can't break. And so they believe that consensus in this context means those gathered in the room. Tricky language.
Very tricky language. Sherwin, we're speaking about of course, the wording, right? And you and I have been talking about how the text is going to be important, because you may find that a country has got an issue with one paragraph, one word, and they believe that for them it makes a huge difference. And I suppose it also speaks to where we are currently with some of the countries, with Argentina, and one is to expect that, you know, the issue of the text is going to be one that the countries do raise from time to time.
I'm based in New York at an institution called the United Nations. You and I have had so many discussions about how difficult consensus is to reach, and we really need to define what consensus means, because in a democracy, when you vote, it's sometimes 50+1 you win the presidency, right? To win an election is sometimes maybe 50% plus 1, 60%. It's not 100% before you can become the president or win an election, depending on what level you're talking about. And so consensus has come to mean something like 100%. But how is that possible when you have 193 member states at the United Nations? Never mind the 193, just ask yourself about the 15 in the Security Council. So consensus, multilateralism is being undermined by unilateralism, by national interests, your national relationship with another country. And the big message, the big takeaway from this presidency of the G20 and the majority that has coalesced around South Africa's presidency is you might agree with a little tidbit here and a bit of language there, but the broad consensus is that climate change is real, that debt distress is real, that food insecurity is real, that climate injustice is real, and we need to figure out how to address those ills, because inequality leads to destabilization, it leads to revolution. And so we cannot talk about economic prosperity if you are not dealing with the people that are suffering at the bottom rung of society. And so this G20 economic stability fora has now had to grapple with those people that find themselves at the bottom of the economic chain, and that is what they are trying to infuse moving forward. The question now becomes, what happens under the G20 presidency of the United States? This baton will transfer to Washington on December 1st. And that's also something we can talk about in terms of the transfer ceremony. But in terms of the agenda that the United States has asserted, it has criticized the breadth of this fora, the G100, call it what you will. They have said they want to go back, they want to whittle it back down, go back to its core mandate. The question is, all these countries that agreed to this agenda are also going to be in the room in the United States. What does the bullying look like then, right? President Ramaphosa said, we are all equal. We must be dealt with as sovereign states sitting as equals around the table. Well, how will the United States, that asserts its America First perspective, how will that unilateralism work in a multilateral fora in a multipolar world? These are powerful states here. You know, they're not going to be railroaded.
And speaking about the dynamics, right, with the US, one thinks about the fact that if you've got the Charge, for example, now we're told, is not going to come here. South Africa's refused for the Charge to come here in order to receive the handover. Now, with the Minister, Ronald Lamola, saying, let it happen at the level of the Charge, because we've got the similar levels at the department, so that's going to happen anytime from next week. It speaks yet again about the dynamics, because that's a matter the US is not going to be happy about, but it's also an indication to the United States to say, you're not the only one in the room.
But it's also, I think, an assertion from South Africa that we have a red line. And we have really tried to be inclusive in this process. We have engaged with you from our bilateral relationship in the White House when the lights were dimmed in the White House, to the fora at the foreign ministers' meetings, the 130 meetings that they've held around the world, including here in South Africa, but also at the United Nations. And I remember a specific moment at the foreign ministers' meeting of the G20 on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and Alison Hooker, the Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs of the United States, really denounced the agenda that South Africa had affirmed and talked about the things that they were going to change. And it was, I'm sure, a very frustrating moment as chair of that meeting for Ronald Lamola to sit there and listen to that meeting when everybody else essentially was endorsing the agenda. And I remember his words precisely. He said, after the Deputy Secretary of State finished, he said, "I thank my sister from the United States. I now call on, the next person." And I thought, wow, what fortitude, what dignity South Africa has presented on the world stage. And I think you've heard from the Secretary General, you've heard from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and I'm sure a number of other leaders thanking the South Africans for how they've conducted the process of engagement. This is heavy lifting. These diplomats, Durko has been working to the bone. Let's give credit where credit is due. They have done an exceptional job. The anomaly in this process has been the United States. The strangeness of the moment has been the United States. And so South Africa has the posture has shifted, I think. They're not just going to be accommodated, they also want respect in return, and they're saying this is not protocol to have not even an ambassador, the person in charge of the embassy, to take a handover from a president. They say, on that level, it's not protocol. We'll do it at our level, at Durko, next week, and it shouldn't offend you.
And speaking about officials that really, as you say, must be commended. For example, you think about the Sherpa, Zane Dango. You think about, Ambassador Xoliso Mabongo, who was the Sous Sherpa. And these are people who would have spoken about how tough the negotiations are at some stage, but then still remaining, focused on the goal, saying this is what we're going to do. As difficult as it is, we're going to cross the line. And that, of course, speaks about Sherwin, as you say, these some 130 odd meetings that would have been had, and the difficult task that lay ahead for them. And the culmination of all of this is all their work.
And also the engagement. The United States was engaging at the Sherpa level. There were some meetings where they were involved. They were coming. President Trump might be coming. Vice President Vance, then he's not coming. That kind of interaction at a foreign diplomatic level matters. And so, essentially, I think the South Africans are saying, we recognize now that the United States has not been a reliable partner and we can't put up with this anymore. So no, you can't come and get the baton from the president at that level. Send us a foreign minister, or, let's give the process some dignity here. And so they're saying, so we will meet you halfway at your level and hand it over to you. And that isn't even necessary. It's ceremonial. The United States on the 1st of December becomes the presidency of the G20, and they will lead this process. South Africa will be part of the Troika, along with the United Kingdom that comes in, will take over from the United States in 2027, and they will then guide this process, the three of them, the one that's just been president, the one that is currently president, and the future president, and that continuity matters. And so we are going to have to impose or certainly engage on the agenda that was adopted here. The United States will then change things because they will lead the process. The United Kingdom has endorsed the process here, so how will they pick it up? But it's certainly not going to be a straight line, I'll tell you that.
Definitely not. And Sherwin, as we talk about the United States, right, I want us to bring up this graphic if it's possible, because when you look about disaster resilience, this is quite an important conversation, and we do know how the United States feel about this one. And the leaders are speaking about, for example, expand early warning systems. It's been the big contention point here in South Africa to say, how then do you begin to ensure that communities actually do get these warnings first? Then you have the strengthening of disaster risk reduction, boost access to disaster finance tools, but also supporting the resilience as far as the countries are concerned. It's a matter that is also controversial for the incoming president, right? Because
it doesn't assert climate change.
He doesn't believe it.
Doesn't believe in the Sustainable Development Agenda, because they do not feel that they have a responsibility as one of the historically largest emitters of CO2. America's a very developed country, and so the developed world is most responsible. Many of them are G20 countries. And South Africa, to a certain extent, also, burns coal and is adding to the problem. And so there has to be a recognition. And this is why Ronald Lamola said earlier this week, we have to find ways to move forward with or without the United States. And so we recognize that there's a problem. The proliferation of evidence, the broad consensus scientifically, which is all you need, right, 99 point whatever %, is that climate change is real, and it's due to carbon dioxide in in the atmosphere that is heating the Earth's temperature to the extent that ice caps are melting, oceans are rising, and climate catastrophe is ensuing. And what are we going to do about it? The United States doesn't recognize the problem. They drill, baby, drill. And so you have to then work around them, but also include them when they want to be included. And that is the complication we face in geopolitics today.
And with the Secretary General yesterday speaking about how he believes that the economic will seems to be there, but the political will needs the bigger push as far as this issue. And the bigger push of the political will is something I'm not sure he's going to get, eh?
Can I show you what political will looks like? Look at Nasrec, look at Joburg today, look at what South Africa has accomplished. The lawns are cut, the paint is fresh, the roads are tarred.
Potholes are gone.
The potholes are gone, security is at a premium, all the diplomats are here, everybody's at their best behavior. That's kind of like what you do when you really want to do something well. This is what it looks like. So political will matters now in terms of getting the declaration adopted, and now political will has to continue in implementing the declaration. What we know about declarations and resolutions is often they are not they're adopted, and the diplomats say, well, we did our job, and they did. Diplomats are not the ones that implement the decisions of member states. It is at the government level, at the local government level, the provincial level, the collaboration between states, the regional blocs, the private sector, civil society. We talked to Vincent Magwenya earlier, the presidential spokesperson, and he said this has been the most inclusive G20 summit. The media was represented, business was represented, civil society was represented, the thinkers, the intellectuals were represented, all parts of society were represented. So all parts of society mustn't be has a responsibility to implement. They can't be saying, well, the government didn't do this. They were very smart about this. They said, okay, we're going to engage with all of you, so you can't blame us if we fail.
So certainly everybody at the table shown. And when you then look at the issues, especially around the African continent, there is that issue of the debt that you and I touched on a little earlier on. And now this borrowers, forum that's going to be created, this borrowers club that the president was talking about, is one that is going to be important, particularly when you think about how the issue of the debt is then dealt with, because African countries have been dealing with this in silos. Now coming together means you kind of like share notes as to how best you can be able to deal with this as a collective.
Where's the money going to come from for the Borrowers Fund? How are we going to capacitate the Borrowers Fund? How long is that capacitation going to take? What is our point of reference? There was a Green Climate Fund that was part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They talked about 100 billion per year, and we very quickly realized, if you listen to the likes of Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, she talks about how the 100 billion is simply not enough. We need trillions every year to be investing. And you talk about the annual SDG finance gap in terms of implementation, why implementation is lagging, because you need $4.3 trillion a year to do all the things we're talking about. And so a great idea in terms of a borrowers fund. Why are they creating a borrowers fund? Because the argument is that getting money from development banks or even the private sector it's happening at a premium. So concessional financing, the cost of borrowing, the cost of credit must be cheaper. It must be cheaper for poorer states, for developing economies that have this big development burden to access money. So the question becomes, are the developed states going to be capacitating the borrowing fund? Is it only going to come from Africa? There's still outstanding questions about how it's going to work. And the urgency is there. The clock is ticking. We've got to get going.
We definitely got to get going, and especially because if you do have countries that are paying more, repaying debt than they are paying for their healthcare systems, that in fact showing as a cause for concern.